starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Monday, April the 11th. I'm Donna Will, Professional Development Coordinator for the Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to Housing Support Services and the role of the CCS. On the panel today, we have Stephanie Jones, Director of Innovations with DDA, and Diane Dressler, Senior Associate with Community Life Resources. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options for listening to the webinar: by computer and phone, and if you have trouble hearing, you can switch by clicking on the appropriate button in the webinar panel in the audio section. There is one handout for this webinar in the handout section, and we are recording the webinar, and that will go on YouTube and the page on the DDA website. So now I'd like to introduce Stephanie Jones. Hi, Stephanie.
Good afternoon, Donna. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's workshop with CCS and Housing Support Specialists. Next slide, Donna. I'm Stephanie Jones. I'm the Director of Innovations, as Donna said, with DDA. And joining me today is Diane Dressler, with the Senior Associate with Computer Life Resources. Our contact information is the first slide there. So after the event, if you think of questions that you didn't think of while the presentation was going on, please feel free to reach out to us. Next slide, please. Our agenda today is we'll be talking about DDA's housing priorities, housing support service overview, and how CCS's and HSS coordination works to help those that we support obtain independent living homes. Next slide, please. DDA is committed to the development, quality, affordable, accessible housing for people with disabilities in safe locations where they can access support services, transportation, employment, recreation throughout their lifespan. We will do this by increasing awareness of housing issues experienced by individuals with developmental disabilities, with the internal structure as well as external partners, stakeholders, and the community at large. Work in partnership with M.P.A. to increase housing options for individuals with developmental disabilities in Maryland. Promote the understanding of the link between self-determination and housing as a critical part of people being able to control their own lives. Next slide, please. Housing supports. Diane, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. As Stephanie said, I'm Diane Dressler. I'm a Senior Associate with Community Life Resources. We are an organization that does consulting on housing, and we work with several organizations in Maryland to increase affordable and accessible housing opportunities for people with disabilities in Maryland. And I'm happy to be working with DDA on their implementation of housing support services. Next slide, please. So I've provided here for you the definition of housing support services that's contained in the DDA Medicaid waivers. Housing support services are a new service that was included in the last update that DDA did for their waivers, and housing support services are included in all three of DDA's waivers, including community pathways, community supports, and family supports. Housing support services are time-limited supports, and they help people investigate housing opportunities, overcome barriers that may be between someone where they are now and their housing goals for their future, and to help people secure their housing, and then to help them retain their home. Next slide, please. So there are three sort of buckets of housing support services. One is housing information and assistance, and these 10 activities are listed in the waiver that fall under this particular category, and it includes providing waiver participants with information about housing programs, their rules, requirements, eligibility, etc. Helping people to search for housing, helping people to apply to live at an apartment or apply for a mortgage if their goal is home ownership, helping people get their documentation together, which is, entails a lot of gathering of information from banks and, demographic information, etc. Helping people to take a look at the unit that they're considering renting or owning to make sure it meets their needs. Helping people request reasonable accommodations and modifications that will help them use and enjoy their housing like people without disabilities. Helping people identify resources for security deposits, moving expenses, furniture, assistive technology, environmental modifications, utility deposits, and other one-time costs. That the Housing Support Service will help people review their lease and other documents, including the community rules, and help them to understand these documents prior to signing the lease. Housing Support Services will help people develop a budget and then maintain that budget and make sure that they can get their rent paid or their mortgage paid and the utilities paid on time. Housing Support Services help people identify and address barriers to housing, such as credit barriers, criminal background, rental history, etc. And then Housing Support Services can help people resolve disputes. Perhaps a person's having a dispute with their landlord or with a neighbor where they're living. Housing Support Services can help people resolve those disputes. Next, Donna. Housing Transition Services are also available through the waiver and are provided by the Housing Support Specialist. And that includes conducting tenant screening and housing assessment, which is, identifying possible barriers to obtaining housing and to retaining the housing that people may have been able to access. And then developing an individualized housing support plan that includes short and long-term goals and strategies to meet those goals, and identifies natural supports and other resources available in the community to help the person meet their goals. Next slide. It also includes, the waiver also includes housing tenancy sustaining services. So the Housing Support Specialist will help people by doing something that we call tenant training, where they will review the lease and the community rules and help people understand their obligations, the landlord's obligations, and how they can be successful as a tenant. It can include coaching people to have a good relationship with their property manager, their landlord, their neighbors, or the maintenance personnel, anyone who may be involved with them where they're living. It will provide assistance with recertification. So many housing subsidy programs, those programs that provide financial assistance for people to be able to afford housing, they often have a recertification process that must be completed annually. And so the Housing Support Specialist can assist people with that process. The Housing Support Specialist will be helping to identify potential problems that may impact continued tenancy, and then to create strategies, provide assistance in resolving those potential problems so that tenancy can continue. So perhaps a person is in jeopardy of violating their lease or the community rules because of some behavior or some other activity occurring at their apartment, and the Housing Support Specialist can help identify that that's an issue and then provide support to overcome that. The Housing Support Specialist will help the person link with other community resources that are going to help support their continued tenancy and prevent eviction. And then, of course, the housing support specialist will annually or as necessary review and update that person-centered housing support plan. Next, Donna. People qualify for housing support services if they are age 18 and above. So even though housing support services are included in the family supports waiver, and people may be under the age of 18 receiving services through that waiver, they're not eligible for housing support services until they are age 18. There is no upper age limit to the eligibility for housing support services. Of course, people need to be enrolled in one of DDA's waivers to be eligible for housing support services, and a housing goal needs to be identified in the person-centered plan. Next slide, please. So a housing goal may be appropriate in a person-centered plan if the individual indicates a desire to have their own home, to either rent or own their own home. It might also be appropriate in a plan when someone is currently renting or owning their own home, but they could benefit from assistance of the housing support specialist to maintain that housing and to continue to be successful. And it's also an appropriate activity or goal in the PCP if someone wants to make a change. So perhaps someone is renting an apartment, things are going really well, but now they've decided that they want to become a homeowner. So it would be appropriate for a housing goal to be included in the person-centered plan to assist someone with working toward achieving that goal. And some examples of the activities that could happen that are identified in the person-centered plan would be, applying for a affordable housing resources, getting support for being a successful tenant by reviewing the lease or community roles or helping with maintaining relationships with the property manager, maintenance staff, the owner, etc. It's possible that someone may need to request a reasonable accommodation or modification, even if they've been residing in their home for a while. People's needs change, and so those kinds of accommodations may be necessary, and the housing support specialist can help people think through those potential reasonable accommodations and modifications and make the request to the housing provider. It might be assistance with maintaining the home, and it might be accessing or changing services to support success. So, along the way, people may need to have a change in their service plan to make sure that they can be successful. Next slide, please. So the housing support specialist, sort of in summary, can help a person create a person-centered housing plan. They can help them locate housing, get resources to make housing affordable, maintain the housing, and maintain being successful as a tenant or homeowner. They can help with communication with landlords, property managers, mortgage companies, whoever it may be. They can assist with making reasonable accommodation modification requests. They can help with accessing services to support success and identifying changes in services that may be needed. And they can help create and maintain a house budget. Next, Donna. So housing support services are provided by agencies who have been authorized to provide housing support services. There's a DDA process for an agency to obtain authorization to provide housing support services. The agency needs to have expertise and experience in housing opportunities for people with disabilities, and their staff need to have completed training as required by DDA. And in a moment, we'll give you a list of the agencies that currently meet those two criteria. I want to make sure we point out that coordinators of community services do not provide housing support services. So the housing support specialist is a separate workforce from coordinators, and they take care of all of those issues that are related to housing for someone who is in the waiver. The coordinator does refer people for housing support services if they have a housing goal in their person-centered plan. The coordinator works with the housing specialist to plan for in-home services and address any kind of needs that are identified along the way. And the coordinator monitors the provision of housing support services, just as they monitor the provision of other services in the person's plan. The next slide, Donna. So this is the list of housing support service providers who have trained housing specialists, and this is as of this month. Training has occurred on 2 occasions previously, and so these agencies have staff who have successfully completed that training. Another training will be occurring the last week in April and 3 weeks in May. So the training for housing support specialists includes 4 full days of training, and training is 1 day a week for 4 weeks. So that's starting at the end of April and will go into the 3rd week of May. And then we will have some additional agencies, I believe, who will have trained housing specialists. And so we will expand this list and make sure everybody gets an expanded list. If agencies want to become authorized to provide housing support services, they could contact their regional office. Stephanie, there's a name for the provider liaison, provider
service specialist.
There you go. The person at the regional office that helps providers with stuff. So they can contact them to find out what the process is to become authorized to provide housing support services. The next slide, Donna. This is straight from the waiver, and it includes the requirements for housing support service provider staff. And so the requirements on the left and the training requirements are on the right. And the training that is provided by Maryland Inclusive Housing for housing support specialists includes all of those topics that are required by the waiver. The next slide, please, Donna. This is a similar list, and it includes the professional requirements for self-directed services. So housing support services can be provided to people who are self-directing, and these are the requirements for those housing support specialists who are assisting people who are self-directing. Next slide. So how are housing support services accessed? What's the process for a person being able to get this kind of service in their plan and then to use it? Well, the first step will be that the waiver participant will talk with their coordinator about their desired housing situation. They may mention that they want to live someplace else, that they would like to have their own place, that they'd like to live alone. People can communicate their preference for their housing situation or a change in their housing situation in a number of different ways. So it's very important to make sure that we listen to people's statements about wanting to change where they're living and respond to those requests. Then if someone states that they want to make a change in their housing situation, then the coordinator will include a housing goal in the person-centered plan with an objective for obtaining housing support services. The coordinator will then provide a list of housing support service providers to the participant, and will help them choose a housing support service provider, just as the coordinator would help a participant choose any other kind of waiver service. The participant will interview the potential housing support service providers with some help from the coordinator or family as needed. And then the housing support service specialist will inform the coordinator when they have been chosen to be the housing support service provider. So the communication between the coordinator and the housing specialist will begin when the participant chooses that particular provider to be their housing support specialist. Next slide, please. Coordinators' housing-related tasks are listed here, and it includes talking with people about their preferences in preparation for their annual person-centered plan, or should a waiver participant decide, in the middle of the year, of the plan year, that they want to make a change, they could certainly communicate that to their coordinator. And perhaps an interim planning meeting would be scheduled to discuss that issue. The coordinator will include a referral to housing support specialists in the plan when the participant states that they want independent renting or home ownership, or to make a change in that. The coordinator will submit the person-centered plan to DDA for approval. They will provide the participant with housing support service provider options for the area where they want to live. They will document the housing support service provider choice in the person-centered plan. They will convene an interim person-centered planning meeting to discuss any service changes that might be necessary to help the participant obtain or be successful in their new home. Typically, when people move from one setting to another one, changes in services are required to support a person in a new environment. So the coordinator will help to discuss those service changes at a PCP meeting. Then they will submit the revised person-centered plan to DDA as needed for approval. They'll meet with the participant and the housing specialist to review the lease and the community rules before the person signs their lease. It's very important for people to have this review happen before they sign their lease so they know what they're signing. A lease is a legal document, so of course it's important for people to understand what they're signing before they do so. The coordinator will notify DDA of the participant's new address when they move. The coordinator will also participate in tenant training with the housing specialists shortly after the person moves into their new home to review that lease again, review the community rules again, make sure that people understand how to use their new home, how to change the thermostat is, one of the things that people need to learn in their new home, or how to change the temperature on the refrigerator. And they may also have questions that didn't come to mind before they moved in, but now that they're living in their new home, they have a lot of questions. So tenant training is scheduled with the coordinator and the housing specialist after someone moves into their new home so that those questions can be answered. Then, of course, the coordinator will monitor the provision of housing support services and communicate with the housing specialist about any issues that the coordinator might have picked up on or identified that might affect the participants' continued housing success and stability. The next slide, please. Now, the housing specialist also has tasks related to the person-centered plan. So once they've been chosen by a waiver participant to provide housing support services, they're going to meet with that participant and perhaps with their family, their provider, to talk about their specific housing desires and needs. And then they will assess the individual's housing resources using a housing assessment tool. During the training for housing support service providers, the participants in the training are provided with a housing assessment tool that they can use to do this assessment. It's not necessary to use that tool, but it's given as a resource. Then the housing support specialist will create a person-centered housing plan that will include the housing goals, objectives to achieving the goals, and will submit that person-centered housing plan to the coordinator for incorporation in the person-centered plan. So the person-centered housing plan is not separate from the PCP. It is a component of the PCP, and should be coordinated with other kinds of goals and objectives that might be included in the person's plan, so that goals are not working against one another. Some examples of person-centered housing plan goals include gaining financial empowerment, gaining some budgeting skills, checking the credit report and correcting any kind of errors that might be on the credit report. And it might also include enrolling people on affordable housing program wait lists. So once that person-centered housing plan is created, it's sent to the coordinator, and the housing specialist will work with the coordinator to incorporate the plan in that component, that housing plan in the overall PCP. The housing specialist will work with the participant to create strategies to achieve their goals, their objectives. They will coordinate with the coordinator to implement new and existing services that will support housing goals. They'll provide the coordinator with some information on whether the strategies they've been using are helpful or not. So perhaps a strategy for budgeting has been attempted and it's not working well, but a different strategy might work. That kind of information is coordinated with the person's CCS so that changes to the plan can be made. They're going to inform the housing specialist will inform the coordinator when a rental or homeownership opportunity has come up. So it could be that a person's on a wait list for a while before they have an opportunity for affordable rental housing. The person may be working on some budgeting skills and other financial tasks that are part of their person-centered plan. But when a housing opportunity arises, then the housing specialist will contact the coordinator so that they can make sure the coordinator is aware of what's going on. If changes are needed in the person-centered plan to support new activities to obtain that housing, that would be worked on by the coordinator and the housing specialist. Now, the housing specialist will also meet with the coordinator and the participant, as we discussed earlier, to go over the lease or homeownership documents and provide education prior to the person signing their lease or any other papers. The housing specialist will meet with the coordinator and the participant after they move in to do tenant training. The housing specialist will identify possible issues that could impact continued tenancy or ownership, and will coordinate with the CCS should any changes in services be needed to support continued success. And then the housing specialist will maintain with communication with the coordinator related to any issues that impact housing goals. So really there's a need for ongoing communication between the housing specialist and the coordinator to make sure that the person's needs and desires are reflected in the person-centered plan, that the person-centered plan is a flexible document that can change as needs change for the person, that any kind of issues that come up along the way that might be identified by either the housing specialist or the coordinator are discussed, and plans for any kind of change in services or interventions are made to help support the person to continue to be successful. So it's important that the housing specialist and the coordinator continue to communicate openly. The next slide, please. And this is really just a summary of how housing specialists coordinate with the CCS. So they'll work with the CCS to incorporate the housing plan into the PCP. They'll coordinate with the CCS to implement new and existing services. They'll consult with the CCS to revise the plan as needed. They'll identify potential issues that could impact success and monitor need for additional assistance. They'll respond to the coordinator's concerns about issues that may be identified that would impact success, and they'll maintain communication related to issues impacting housing goals. The next slide, please. So we have time for questions now. There's one other item that I want to review with everybody before we take the questions. It is possible that some of the coordinators on this webinar have put people on a wait list for housing on one of the social serve wait list programs, such as HUD 811 or Weinberg. If you are a coordinator who has put someone on the social serve wait list for housing, when the new DDA rent subsidy program comes along, DDA has made a decision that the only people who can, the only staff who can put someone on the wait list for that housing program is the housing specialist. So if you're a coordinator and you've already got people on that social serve wait list and they now have a housing specialist, that information needs to be communicated to Christina Bolliard at MDOD, at Maryland Department of Disabilities. Christina will be able to make a change in agencies that are the identified case manager for the person on that wait list. So again, to make sure that I've made that clear, if you're a coordinator, you've put people on the social serve wait list and they now have a housing specialist, that change in agency needs to be communicated to Christina Bolliard at MDOD. And now, Stephanie, I think we're ready for questions.
Okay, Diane, thank you. Our first question, I think, our first question, and how does this work with the family support waiver? I thought residential was only in CP waivers. And again, housing support services is not for assistance with finding facility-based residential services. It's for specifically people who want to live independently and obtain a lease and or mortgage. So I hope that was helpful. What is the date the DDA rent subsidy program webinar? Will it be held on April 29th at 12 noon?
I think that one was canceled.
Yeah, we canceled the one on the 29th. We've done a couple of webinars, rent subsidy webinars. We just did one on last Thursday as well, and we'll do another one in May for a complete overview. Let's go to the next.
Yeah, I'm looking for the date for the new rent subsidy program training, and that will be May 12th at noon. An announcement will come out, but that's May 12th at noon.
Where can we be able to locate extensive list of providers who offer HHS program DDA website? Yes, the website. Oh, and probably you can reach out to the regional office if you can't find it there.
We also provided a list in the slides that you will be
Yeah,
getting.
there's a list in the slide as well, correct. When is SDS?
Self-directed.
When is self-directed services? Are the housing providers willing to contract with individuals as vendors to provide the service instead of the person hiring a staff? That is a question that probably I need to take and get answered for you through our director of provider services, or one of the people who do self-direction. So I will take that back and get that answer to you. If you want to go ahead and email me that question to stephanie.jones2@maryland.gov, that would be great. Is HSS effective now? Yes.
Yes.
Will HHS specialists be responsible for completing a SIP?
Completing a
It says SIP. I'm not sure what that is.
SIP.
So again, if you would email me that question, I will forward it to the appropriate person to answer that. I think that would be probably a provider relations question as well. Does the HSS complete a DSAT cost detail and a SIP for the service to the PCP for DDA review and approval for PCP? A PCP update does have to be, if this is a new service to the person, it does have to be in the PCP and on the budget. So I do know that. It has, because it's a service, so it has to be an approved service in the PCP. Can the PCP be submitted to obtain HSS in the PCP, and then later can the PCP be revised to include housing plan from HHS specialists? My individual has their annual plan due on about a month. Yes, it can be done 2 different times.
I think when I think through the process, I think it probably will need to be done 2 times, because initially the coordinator will refer the person for housing support services. And once the individual gets a housing specialist, that specialist will do a person-centered housing plan, which gets incorporated into PCP. So it is a 2-step process initially.
And the person-centered housing plan in a format, is that a different than the service implementation plan? And that's yes.
SIP, service implementation plan.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's okay.
I couldn't figure out what those 3 initials were.
Yeah, I could. Okay. But the housing support specialist does do a separate housing plan document, don't they?
They will create a separate plan document, but that document needs to be incorporated into the overall PCP.
Correct.
So,
I think what they were asking.
Format's okay. We don't have any specific format that the housing specialists are using to create that person-centered housing plan. So there's no prescribed format that's come from DDA. So with the help of the coordinator, we'll make sure that that housing plan and those goals get incorporated into the PCP in whatever way makes sense.
Great, thank you. Would this service be appropriate for an individual who currently lives independently and receives supported living services, has natural supports, but may still need additional support. So after reviewing with the team, I think yes, if they need additional support with maintaining housing, because part of the definition is to maintain housing, then yes, this would be appropriate for them. Will you put Christina's contact information in the DDA website? We can put it in the chat here.
Here, let me type it in for you.
Yeah, type it in the chat. We'll type it in the chat for you. And it's also on the, you can find her on the DOD website.
I can only send it to organizers. So Donna, if you will send this out to folks, I'd appreciate it.
And is this self-directed service? Is this available to self-directed services? And if so, will the participants need to use DDA provider as a vendor and access these services? It is available to self-directed services, and at this time, you may, but have to start with a DDA vendor until your staff is trained to provide that service. Is that correct, Diane?
Well, the service can only be provided by a person who meets the criteria, the waiver, and that includes the training that is required for housing specialists. So I would say, you know, an individual person could take that training and provide housing support services to someone who's self-directing.
Okay. What is the effective date, the effective start date? The wait list for the DDA rent subsidy waiver will open on May 1st in social serve. So this again is asking about self-direction. Diane just answered that. What does the DDA rent subsidy wait list open? I just told you that, May 1st. Service, and thank you for Mary for telling me what SIP was. And I think we answered that yes, it does have to be implemented into there. I appreciate everyone. I am new, so I appreciate everyone letting me know what that acronym meant. Because I got it a few times. Someone, a few people informed me what SIP was. Let's see, I'm not sure if I missed it, this answer question, but some programs like Social Serve requires a program in place before requires a CCS referral. Yes, for this one, so it says, Diane, this is for you.
Okay. You want me to?
Yeah, the social serve requires a case manager to be in place. Right. So the person will still have their CCS and their housing support service specialist.
But in terms of the social serve waitlist system, a case manager needs to be identified for the person, and the case manager places the person on the wait list. We use the term case manager very loosely. So that could be, it could be a coordinator, it could be a support planner, it could be, you know, a case manager within the behavioral health system. It can also be a housing support specialist. So they are considered a case manager for the social serve waitlist system.
This is if a person is receiving only state-owned. Is this an option? No, you have to be within one of the waivers.
Correct. It's a Medicaid waiver.
It's a Medicaid waiver service. How are providers of HHS reimbursed for the time to complete the housing assessment and person-centered housing plan if they are required to be completed prior to PCP approval services? They're not required to be completed prior to PCP approval services.
Right. The service will be approved by DDA in the PCP, and then the person will get a housing specialist, and that specialist will be able to start billing for the services they provide.
What is the time limit for HSS? A year or so. There is a limit on hours of services.
But it's ongoing over years. So there's, a person could have housing support services for years, as long as they have housing needs that are, independent housing needs. But the number of hours per year are limited. And I forget what that number is right now.
So we would upload the housing plan into the PCP. However, other services are included into the PCP now. Let's see. Can you provide an example flow chart, something to assist CCS's initial HHS request, referral, and then how to proceed with the HHS has been selected, a plan provided to include the service in the revised PCP? Absolutely. Actually, we have developed that, haven't we, Diane?
We have
the flow and a checklist for you. It just has to be approved before we can send it out. So the wait list opens before the training. No, there have been some providers, some HHS providers that were listed in the presentation that have already gone through the training. And we have also already done a complete webinar for the rent subsidy program we did. We've done two or three now for different groups. So,
but keep in mind that the only person that can put somebody on the wait list for the DDA rent subsidy program is a housing specialist. They've all been trained. The new group that I'll be training in April and May will, of course, get this information as well. And so they already are aware of the rent subsidy program. And once they're engaged with someone in housing support services, if that is something that the person would like to do, to get on the wait list for the DDA rent subsidy program, then the housing specialist is prepared to do that for them.
The next question is, how does a person get on the wait list if they currently have a PCP? Does the PCP have to be revised? Yes, the PCP has to be revised to add housing support specialist service. Can we still submit the PCP? Can we still submit the PCP for approval if the housing service provider is delayed or has not submitted their portion? I would say yes. We got 10 minutes. Let's see if we can get through all of these real fast. If the housing support specialist needs to include an assessment as part of their PCP, will the delay for the PCP process will a revised plan be needed once HHS has completed an assessment? I cannot see this being completed and assessment being approved for HSS. Has this been a trouble for Diane that you know of for people who currently are receiving the service?
No, but again, as we stated just a little bit ago, it's going to be a two-step process. The first step being adding housing support services to the person's plan and making that referral to a housing support service provider. Once the person selects their housing support service provider, then that housing specialist will do an assessment and will create a person-centered housing plan in coordination with the person they're supporting. And then that gets sent to the coordinator for incorporation into the person-centered plan. So it is a two-step process initially. The assessment itself does not necessarily go into the PCP. It is a tool that the housing specialist will use to help create the person-centered housing plan.
Thank you. Rent supplements that are currently provided as a standalone service will need to be requested. So if the person is currently receiving rental assistance through DDA, and if that is the only thing they're getting, and so it's state funded, that person is not on any of the 3 waivers, then they would not qualify for a housing support service specialist. If they are on the waivers, they would have to have another service. So that would mean they would be within the waiver. And if they choose to want to investigate whether the rent subsidy will work for them, yes, you can include that in their new PCP. Housing support service providers will need to complete a service implementation plan SIP once they decide to provide the service, which must be linked to an outcome in the PCP. I think Lauren is online with us. Because that sounded pretty.
She's on the ground doing this, so
yeah, she's on the ground.
She knows those details.
Thank you, whoever wrote the answer there. I appreciate your help. I am new as well. I have a family member with a service. My question is, will this be a good service for someone who does know capable of handling own business needs? So if they are on the waiver, on one of the 3 waivers, and you think that, and you explained the service definition to them, and you think this would be helpful, yes, you can add housing support services to them. Just if they want to investigate housing choices. And again, if they, have it for a little while and choose not to proceed, you can always discontinue it. To clarify, a participant will need to have case manager in place by May 1st in order to get on the wait list when it opens.
That's true, but let me explain it a little bit more. The wait list will open May 1st. The actual rent subsidy program will open at a later date. We have not decided how long we'll wait. We wanted to wait for the wait list to get, some people on it, because the program is prioritized to protect certain populations. So the date and time stamp of getting on the wait list is not necessarily as important as the priority population, or the groups of people that DDA has chosen to prioritize for the subsidy.
How does behavior affect those interested in housing? That would be something the team would have to work through. There are going to be other supports, and like one of the slides talked about, the CCS and the HSS working together to see what supports is needed for the person to remain in their home safely and address their living needs. So that would have to be a team discussion. What is social serve, Diane?
Oh, sorry. Social Serve is a web-based housing subsidy waitlist system that is used by Maryland for its affordable housing programs for people with disabilities. So it is accessed, the programs on that waitlist are accessed by a case manager. And as I said earlier, case manager is a pretty loose term for, staff that would have the role of helping people with their housing needs. So a case manager needs to enter somebody on the wait list. And there are several different programs that are available for people with disabilities on that wait list. So the housing support specialists are all aware of what those programs are, what the eligibility criteria are, et cetera. And that's one of the great benefits that the housing specialist can provide for people, is to help them understand the different programs and what they might be eligible for and what they might want to apply for.
Okay. So this person wants to know, should CCS continue to place those referrals for social serve, or only the housing support specialist? Just want to confirm. So we encourage that you add housing support services to people's PCP so that they can get the long-term support that a housing support specialist will provide them once being on the social serve website. Are the DDA staff PCP reviewers at this time trained regarding what to look for regarding HHS services? I believe yes. It says, is 175 hours the max for the year? I would have to look into that. Do you remember, Diane?
Right, but I have to look back at the waiver to make sure.
Please clarify if the cost detail and the detailed service authorization tool documentation need to be submitted by the HSS provider to support the services within the PCP. So if whatever you currently have to submit to add a service, because again, this is a waiver service, that's what you would need to submit for this service to be added to the PCP. How are HSS assigned to the participant? They choose, the CSS provides the family and member with a list of providers, just like if they were choosing a meaningful day provider, and that person chooses which provider they would like to go with, and that is then it's added to the plan. Anything to add there, Diane?
No, I think that sounds like the process to me.
No, the rent subsidy it says rent subsidy / funding will be included within the HHS. So no, the rent subsidy is a totally separate tool, or totally separate from housing support services. Housing support services is a service within the waivers, the DDA waivers. Rent subsidy is just a, it's just that it is a funding source to assist people with trying to find housing to live independently. So it's outside of the rent subsidy itself, is outside of the waiver. We have 1 minute. So the first part is to identify an individual who wants to participate in housing support services. Refer a provider to the person. On HSS, submit PCP with the HHS service. And once it's approved, submit the PCP for the plan, inclusion, and revise. Let's see. Then the second part is for the HSS to develop their PCP plan to be included in the PCP. So yes, it's a two-part process to begin with. Yes.
That all sounded right.
And yes. So it's 3:00. If I didn't get to your question, I'll get a transcript of that and try to get back with you and do a frequently asked to once we post it online, or you can reach out to me. Thank you all for your time this afternoon. We appreciate it. Again, if you have any additional questions, let me know and I'll try to answer them. And look out for further trainings.